respected guests, ladies and gentlemen, I want to welcome you all to this conference and extend my deepest appreciation for the efforts you have made to come here today. This is the annual conference of the Palestine Return Centre. Since 2009, our annual conference was the launchpad for Palestine Memorial Week, which is commemorated across Britain and around the world. We are proud to have launched Palestinian Memorial Week, and the success of this initiative can be seen across universities in the UK. This year, our conference has an added significance. It will be the launchpad for the Balfour campaign. We are delighted to be launching this long campaign to mark 100 years of the Balfour Declaration. The conference will highlight Britain's legacy in Palestine and provide us all with the opportunity to share our ideas or running such an important campaign. At the heart of Britain's legacy and the campaign is the Balfour Declaration. It's the symbol around which we can talk about 3 decades of British rule in Palestine. Through your support and the support of others in the UK, in Europe and around the world, we will call on the British government to atone for its policies in Palestine. The Court of Public Opinion will judge British policy in Palestine and demand an apology. We will pursue all legal and political avenues to ensure that reparations are made to those Palestinians who endured immense suffering. I want to thank you again for your participation. I hope you find this conference fruitful and gives you the opportunity to discover and share your ideas with us. Thank you.
I'm so happy to be here today and to participate in this conference, which I think it is a very important conference that should have some reverberations in the future, I hope, with the recommendations that could come up at the end of the day. 95 years ago, a letter has dictated over the world a new political map in the Middle East. And today, if we talk about the current affairs of the Middle East, it's because of that letter that was sent to Baron Rothschild promising a national home for the Jews in Palestine. Great Britain and its government had added insult to injury. It did not destroy Palestine. It did not start its colonial imperialism in Palestine. It did not stop when it left with bloodshed and expulsion of 2/3 of our people. It continued with its insult of the Palestinian people by taking positions and attitudes that have been always supportive of the Zionist dream in forming what we call Eretz Israel, which is the land of Israel. We understood this policy back in the early 20s and 30s. But we cannot understand today's interest, geostrategic interest of the UK in the Middle East, knowing for a fact that the cause of instability and insecurity in the Middle East is the non-resolution of this conflict. They cannot continue with crisis management, because crisis management is a recipe for disaster. And it is so unfortunate that this great country that had a brilliant history of imperialism succumbs to the diktats of the United States foreign policy. And every time I sit with officials and I tell them, you owe it to us, you understand our psychology, you colonized us, you were, part and parcel of the evolution of this nationalism that came as a result of the concepts of nation states and what have you, European concept of revolution. And yet, you are working against your conscience in supporting the Zionist dream and in supporting Israel's policies of expansion and creeping annexation of West Bank territories. How do you explain that? Well, they say, politically we cannot really have any kind of influence in the region because we are basically indirectly, under the wings of the United States. Only the United States can have some political actions, when it comes basic to this conflict. I say then, can't you play the role of an honest broker, since we don't have an honest broker of peace, and this has been proven for the last 20 years, of this futile peace process that brought nothing except more settlements, except more control, except more humiliation, and ultimately the creation of an apartheid state. Does the United Kingdom wants to see an apartheid state in that part of the world, or do they want to see an independent Palestinian state democratically elected next to Israel? This is the time where we have to shake the conscience, not only of the public, but of this government, to shoulder its responsibility once and for all, to stop this, nonsense of settlements, and to think that there will never be a secure peace, justice in the Middle East without resolving the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Thank you very much.
I will be very brief because I've been asked to do 7 minutes, and I will try and stick to that, and Nassim will tell me if I don't. Firstly, I want to say a huge thank you to Palestine Return Centre for its establishment and its work over many years, and for giving a very solid base of information, understanding and support for Palestinians and Palestinian history and the cause surrounding it, because it's actually very important that our supporters don't just go down the road demanding, as they must, freedom and justice for Palestinian people, but have a serious understanding of how this oppression of Palestinian people came about and how the division of the people came about. Understanding of history is something that guides people throughout their lives, and it's why I'm absolutely passionate that if I had to have only one core subject on every school curriculum in every country in the world, it would be history, not anything else. The other evening we had a meeting in Parliament in which Manuel made an incredibly powerful and passionate and effective speech about the history of Palestine, the rights of the Palestinian people. This was dutifully recorded by the thankfully silent Zionists who were in the audience on that occasion, and then came up and berated him afterwards for what he had said. They clearly have two problems. One is they don't want to study history, and secondly, having lived in this country for a very long time, probably all their lives, they don't understand English irony either. Manuel does understand English irony and uses it very, very effectively, so I think they needed two lessons which we can perhaps help them with. But we have to then look at, in the period 1917 when the Balfour Declaration was written, at that time even the very far-sighted and very smart people, and don't underestimate them, in the then Colonial Office and Foreign Office could not have known that at the conclusion of the First World War would be the Versailles Conference, and would be that sort of frankly abominable process where they sat around the table and calmly divided up the colonies of the defeated nations and handed them out as mandates. No different really to the 1884 Congress of Berlin that calmly sat around a table and divided up Africa between the conquering powers. They could not have known at that stage that the mandate territories would be divided up across the region, and France would get some and Britain would get others, and then the dishonesty, the deception, the lies, the Balfour Declaration came home to roost, having promised one thing to the Zionists and another thing to the Palestinians. They then proceeded to divide and conquer, which is, of course, the fundamentals of all empires. And I'm sure many of you have been at various times in Jerusalem. It's quite instructive, obviously, walking around East Jerusalem and the beauties of the old city, but it's also instructive to go to West Jerusalem if you're able to, and see the buildings that Britain put up in the 1930s at a time of unbelievable economic chaos at this end of the empire. They were nevertheless building buildings to last. They were building a colony to last for a very long time, in exactly the same time that Lutyens was designing New Delhi and the Eternal Empire in India. It all came crashing down around their heads only a few years later, and that vile oppression of Palestinian trade unionists, progressive opinion, and the denigration of Palestinians and their history. I was brought up being told at school that Israel was founded on a piece of empty space, and that they managed to make the desert bloom, and they built things when there was nothing there before. Anybody that studies the history of the region will know that at the end of the Second World War, 1945 to 48 period, Palestine had media, had industry, had education, had universities, had a relatively high standard of living for the whole region, and was a coherent society and a coherent state. It was a denigration of that which enabled Western opinion to be put together in support of Israel. I noticed later on today a very interesting session. I'm hoping to get back in, if I can, for it, I'm not sure. And that is the implications of the Mau Mau case for Palestinians, which Martin Linton is going to talk about. Because what needs to be done in this country is an understanding of what the brutality of empire is all about. Britain took part in the partition of Africa. Britain took part in the slave trade before that. Britain took part in the Mandate territories in the 1930s. And even at the end of the Second World War, a war fought against fascism, a war fought for democracy, for peace, for freedom, we are told. Britain, nevertheless, in 1945, was straight at it, joining in with the oppression of the Vietnamese people in Vietnam, in Indonesia, in Malaya, and crucially in Kenya. But these things come home to roost. And there was some kind of historical epiphany for me, sitting in the High Court earlier this year with the Mau Mau people who are making their application for justice and compensation for what happened to them in the 1950s in Kenya, when they were tortured, murdered, brutalized, castrated, every kind of vile piece of treatment you can imagine, and put in concentration camps that can only be akin to Nazi concentration camps. They had their day in court, and they won their right of application for appeal, and that is going to go ahead, hopefully, very, very quickly. They are very, very old people, but I just thought, fair play to them for being able to get it to that state. So we need to understand, and everyone needs to understand, far more about the history of the way in which the Palestinian people were divided and sent to the four winds. But it hasn't worked, because that sense of unity of Palestinian people, be they in refugee camps, be they within the 1948 borders, the West Bank or Gaza, or indeed anywhere else in the world, are making their voices felt. We've won that vote at the UN. We've gained such a huge level of public support in this country and many other places because of that sense of solidarity. But we need to teach the next generation to understand the history of the brutality of colonialism, the brutality of occupation, brutality of partition, and at the end of the day it ends up brutalizing yourself, because you have to have oppressive laws in order to maintain the oppression elsewhere. It's not a liberation to oppress other people, it's an oppression of yourself to oppress other people. So let's understand that history, and at this conference today I think it's absolutely fantastic event that we're having, and I really do admire and applaud the work of the Palestine Return Centre, because building those blocks of knowledge and support is something that we will all benefit from for decades and decades to come, as we move rapidly towards the final denouement, which will be the liberation and unity of all of the Palestinian people. Thank you very much.
What we're going to do in my presentation is look at the theological and ideological roots of the Balfour Declaration. I'm going to introduce you to a concept called Christian Zionism, which you may or may not be familiar with. But the point I'm trying to get across this morning is that Zionism as a political movement historically was undergirded by Christians who were convinced that Zionism was the fulfillment of biblical prophecy and, in some sense, the will of God. In the early 17th and 18th century, you find political religious movements in the United States and in Europe, influenced by speakers, leaders such as Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield, who began to teach that the Jewish people would come to faith in Jesus, they would become Christians, and then they would be returned to their historic lands as a Christian nation, in the same way that in the 19th century other parts of the world were being Christianized by our colonial endeavors. In Britain, the Zionist movement can be dated to around 1801, when an individual, Joseph Frey, founded the London Jew Society. He moved from Germany to London, seeing the plight of Jewish people in East London in particular. He formed this new society to visit and relieve the sick and distressed and instruct the ignorant, especially such as of the Jewish nation. Colleagues of Joseph Frey, Lewis Way, had a prophetic role in this movement. Joseph Wolf was a rather eccentric missionary who went off to Central Asia in search of the lost tribes of Israel. And Charles Simeon, who probably was the most influential of these early leaders, had a more explicit evangelistic ministry seeking to lead Jewish people to faith, to the Christian faith. But the conviction upon which this society was founded was that there would soon be a union between the Jews and Christians to form a universal church. Well, that was quite a dramatic statement from Napoleon. He had another agenda, as most political leaders did at the time. He saw a compliant Jewish presence controlling Palestine alongside French imperial and commercial interests as a strategic relationship that would enable France to control India, Arabia, and Africa, because Palestine was the bridge to Africa and Asia. 1807, he plotted the division of Europe with the Tsar of Russia, blockaded British seaports. 2 years later, he arrested the Pope, annexed the Papal States, a systematic destruction of the Catholic Church in France. He seized its assets, executed priests, exiled the Pope, so that by 1815, his armies had fought, invaded, and subjugated most of Europe and the Middle East, including Italy, Austria, Germany, Poland, Russia, Palestine, and Egypt. Zionism would probably have remained a religious ideal, perhaps as influential as the attempts by the Armenians or the Kurds to find political autonomy today, were it not for Lord Shaftesbury and a number of other political leaders, British leaders, who turned these religious ideas I've introduced you to into a political reality. Shaftesbury probably did more than any other political leader, political, diplomatic, or ecclesiastical leader, to translate the religious ideas I've introduced you to into a political strategy. Indeed, when Theodor Herzl came up with his phrase, "a land of no people for a people with no land," he was borrowing it from Lord Shaftesbury. 50 years earlier, Shaftesbury had written about a country without a nation, for a nation without a country. So like Moses, Shaftesbury did not live to see his promised land realized. However, through his lobbying, his writing, and political speaking, he did more than any other British politician to inspire a generation of Joshuas to translate his religious vision into a political reality. Thank you. William Heschler. I'm not going to spend any time on William Heschler other than to say that if you read any history of Theodor Herzl, particularly those from Israeli sources, you'll very rarely find any reference to William Heschler. And yet William Heschler was a profound and dominant influence over Herzl, and Herzl even admits in his own diary the influence of Heschler in facilitating Herzl to gain a hearing in the political circles of Europe. He talks about this individual who gave him excellent advice, unmistakable, genuine goodwill. He's at once clever and mystical, cunning and naive, everything you look for in a parish priest these days. David Lloyd George said he was converted to Zionism by acetone. The relationship with Chaim Weizmann was clearly an influence in his thinking. But I really want to major on the Balfour Declaration in the last 5 minutes I have, because Balfour saw history as the instrument for carrying out divine purpose. This idea of manifest destiny is something that really can be traced to Balfour and his convictions of Britain's role in Palestine. You may or may not be aware that the Balfour Declaration was rushed out to avoid Germany offering the Jews a Palestinian homeland. The Germans, as you know, in the First World War, Germany and Britain were at war with each other, and Germany was formulating a similar declaration, but Britain got in first. In 1921, Britain created the most extensive empire in world history, became the foremost global superpower. The British Empire had a population of 458 million, 1/4 of the world's population. It covered 36 million square kilometres, or 1/4 of the Earth's total landmass. And that included the mandate. This is the context in which the Balfour Declaration gave Zionism, for its first time, its political legitimacy, led to the 1947 partition plan, which was exactly what has been explained already, a divide and rule plan, the UN recognition, 1948, the armistice of 1949, the 67 borders, the continuing destructive legacy of the duplicitous and broken promises made in the Balfour Declaration are only too obvious today. And with its centenary approaching, that, I hope, is why we are here today, to do something about its resolution and not its perpetuation. Thank you.
Policies can be changed, and indeed there is a reckoning that Britain has come to for a number of things over the years. Slave trade, occupation of various places, abominable treatment of the Chagos Islanders. Australia, for example, gave an apology to the indigenous people of Australia for their treatment. So yes, things can change. And I think on the 100th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration, the fundamental dishonesty of saying to the Zionists, you can have your state, and saying to the Palestinian people, you can lead an undisturbed life forevermore and it won't make any difference. And I think this conference today has highlighted those double standards and that hypocrisy, and the assertion of the rights of the Palestinian diaspora, the Palestinian people living in the camps in Syria and Lebanon and Jordan, and the Palestinian people within the 48 borders of Israel, the West Bank and Gaza. That unity is something that is going to win, and I think the vote at the UN, limited in one way but historic in another, is very significant. We're right to demand it, and I hope we achieve it. Now, in the case of the Chagos Islanders, a much smaller number of people, the hypocrisy is fundamental on that one, and I'm very involved in that campaign, the campaign of the Mau Mau people for a just settlement of the brutal treatment they achieved, begins to change that atmosphere. Now think about it, Palestine, 1945, was a sophisticated place for the Middle East. It had industries, it had education, it had broadcasting, it had newspapers, and it was presented to the world as being an empty territory that was filled up by the settlers who founded the State of Israel, and that there was nobody living there. I was brought up at school being told there was nobody there, and that's why the Jewish people went there. Well, not all Jewish people went there, not all Jewish people support the behaviour of the State of Israel. So yes, of course we can achieve change.
Well, it has been consistent. Britain's policy towards Palestine has been consistent over the last 100 years. And it has certain strategic interests in the region where Palestine is located. And in that sense, we would see some continuity. But as I would like to say that Palestine was not on the agenda of the Zionist movement initially. They were basically looking for a place of refuge. And hence the reason the same Balfour, who signed the declaration in 1917, when he was Prime Minister in 1903, actually offered Uganda. So it was a question of, finding a place of refuge for the Jews who were being persecuted in Europe. However, Britain's imperial strategic interests, and at the time which was very much linked to India and Africa, found it necessary for a foothold in Palestine, which was the link between both continents, both the Asian and the African continents. So today, however, the only strategic change is the importance, the rising importance of oil, and the sea routes, of course, have remained the same. But the question of cheap oil and its delivery to European industries will remain a very central in strategic thinking and policy making for some time. We should not overlook the role of the United States in all of this, in the making of this tragedy. Indeed, the Balfour Declaration itself, although Arthur Balfour signed it, the document was actually read and endorsed in Washington. The drafts of the document were sent to Washington, and at the time, the Chief Justice, who was a Zionist, the president of his name is Louis Brandeis, he actually acted as a mediator to President Woodrow Wilson. Forwarded the document to President Woodrow Wilson, he endorsed it, they made a few amendments, sent it back to London, and then Balfour put his signature to it. So while Britain bears the ultimate responsibility, and it carries the name of Balfour, indeed, the Americans played a role in it, and historically, they bear some responsibility.
So, some of my remarks will recap on Stephen Sizer's excellent lecture, which was not intended, but it's inevitable, I think, that this will happen. Now, if we home in on Balfour, to the Balfour, what led up to it, what was the sort of context, it's very important, of course, always to look at the context of these things, and many people have done so, I know. A lot has been written about the Balfour Declaration, and a lot of history has been invoked as an explanation for this extraordinary promise made. Of course, in the immediate background, quite apart from the Christian Zionism, which Stephen has so eloquently described, quite apart from that hanging around those ideas, the immediate background, of course, was that Britain was an imperial power. We have to remember that. So it's not as if we're looking at the Britain of today. This was a Britain in an age in which there was a tremendous self-confidence about Britain and its role in the world. Tremendous, in a way we probably can't understand. Quite recently, I was reading a biography of Gertrude Bell, the woman who had such a signal role in fashioning the modern Iraqi state. And she lived through the era when the Balfour Declaration was written. And what is so striking about this, the thing that really struck me was, of course, that Britain had played this role in so many different countries. But the really striking thing is letters from Lord Kitchener at the time talking about the Arabs. So this was in the context of the Sharif Hussein of Mecca, of the McMahon correspondence, which people in this room may well be familiar with, about how to gain Arab trust and their support for the war against the Turks in return for a promise of Arab independence. And in Kitchener's letters, he makes very clear the British attitude. He tells Gertrude Bell look, get this straight. I mean, obviously he didn't put it like that, but he said the Arabs will never be united, so don't worry about that. They are disunited, they are tribal, they will never get their act together. That's very painful, by the way, for us looking at the situation today. However, he then says, and really, we will tell them whatever sounds good to get what we want, but let's be very clear that this has nothing to do with what we're going to give them or what is going to happen. So, in other words, the Palestinians in 1917, when we're poised to see the end of the Ottoman Empire, the end of the war, and the entry of the British via the British Mandate in 1922 into Palestine, the Palestinians had two sets of enemies, not just one. One, Imperial Britain, and two, the Zionist movement. It's a very, very big foe for them to try to fight. Needless to say, the news about the Balfour Declaration spread, and there were inevitably riots. Right from the beginning, in 1920, the Palestinians, the Arabs of Palestine, were rioting. They had no political representation. They had no real leadership. The way they showed their anxiety and their worry was through rioting again and again and again, and lots of unrest. And the British role throughout the mandate can really only be described as not just hypocritical and double-dealing, but in fact despicable. In hindsight, they enabled the creation of a huge problem for the region, not for Britain, but for the region. And so from the moment that they pressured the League of Nations to give them a mandate amended so that it included the Balfour Declaration. Imagine such a thing already, right at the very beginning. You have this inherent contradiction that on the one hand, a mandate is there for the imperial power to help the people towards independence, and in the case of Britain, they're supposed to be doing that at the same time as they are facilitating the entry of another people into the very same land. And so on to 1933 and the rise of Nazism. And here we have the second giant reason why we have a state of Israel today. The rise of Nazism, of course, led to Jewish immigration, increased immigration. The British still continued with their promises as in the Balfour Declaration. And in 1936, it led to the general strike on the part of Palestinians. Huge strike, very crippling, very tragic, 36 to 39, dealt with very brutally by the British authorities. Many Palestinian leaders executed, people starving by the end. This dramatic moment in Palestinian history led to another soul-searching on the part of London, which then came up with the Peel Commission, drawn up by Earl Peel. And that Peel Commission identified the problem that there were two communities now in Palestine, both of which had their own national aspirations, but they were irreconcilable. And so Earl Peel recommended partition. And that is the first time we hear about partition in this formal way. Although I want to remind you that the idea of partition was around right from the beginning, because the British played this role in which they treated the Palestinians in one way and they treated the Zionist and the Jewish community in another. And so it's a history of blunder, failure, cynicism, political expediency, all at the expense of the people, which could in no way have fought that. And I just want to draw attention to the fact, something that I've always thought was very important in this. And although I really very much appreciate Dr. Hassassian's description of Palestinians as not a sort of backward people. In fact, the reality is most of Palestine's population was agricultural. You're quite right that in the cities there was an educated elite, but really the majority of people in Palestine were agricultural. They were not in a position to understand this thing called Zionism. They could not have understood it. Zionism is a product of Europe. It's a highly complex, difficult idea, which it's taken many people to wrestle with, to understand its roots and so on. No way could a Palestinian population with a completely unsophisticated, mostly illiterate and uneducated, could they have possibly coped with understanding what was this force that had invaded them. And that, I think, is terribly sad. I think the British knew it, and they are all the more culpable for having brought in a movement which was far, far more advanced and developed than they were at the time. Thank you.
I'll start with sort of definitions of the term that, for me, that inform my presentation and much of my work. At first, I would like to make a distinction between guilt and responsibility. And indeed, the United Kingdom, Great Britain, the people under UK sovereignty, civil society have a responsibility which I'm about to define. But I would suggest that guilt is not ascribed on a collective basis. Every infant born on this land is born as an innocent individual. Any infant born in any part of planet Earth is innocent. There's no collective guilt. But there is a measure of responsibility in the sense that the crimes perpetrated by succession of British governments have been perpetrated in the name of the British people. And in this sense, there is a responsibility on British people to step forward and shout at the top of their voice, not in our name. The same distinction applies to any human person, whether Arab or Jewish or Buddhist or Christian. There is no collective guilt, and I made my first mistake here. Arab is not equivalent to Jewish or Christian, etc. So I apologize. But see whether there are bits and pieces in the Accords that can serve as useful building blocks for a better future strategy. And it is in this frame that I wish to illustrate my contribution to the title of this conference, Britain's Colonial Legacy in Palestine, by focusing on two highlights. The first is United Nations Resolution 181 of 1947, recommending the partition of the country of Palestine not into two segments, not into a Jewish state and an Arab state, but into three segments: an Arab state, a Jewish state, and the city of Jerusalem as a separate corpus separandum, separate territory under UN administration. And the other, of course, a document proclaimed 30 years earlier, the Balfour Declaration. And I will start with the partition plan for Palestine of 1947, which has been rightfully rejected by the leadership of the Palestinian people at the time. And had I been a conscious adult in 1947, I would have joined that rejection. If you read the Apartheid Israel Declaration of Independence, you will find there a reference to the United Nations Resolution 181 of 1947, claiming that this resolution endows international legitimacy, to a degree at least, to the idea of the Jewish state. And if we insist on reading the resolution also in legal terms, we need and we ought to say that is correct, but not in the political Zionist interpretation of a Jewish state, not in apartheid terms. The resolution allows a measure of international recognition to the idea of Jewish state, first of all, only in the 1947 borders as delineated in that resolution. Secondly, as a binational state. And then within the frame of a democratic constitution, and the resolution has the black on white, the elements of a democratic liberal constitution for the Jewish state and for the Arab state, and these are mirror constitutions with economic union. I will refer to the Balfour Declaration a bit with a tongue in cheek, because I want to suggest that given the incremental advance of Palestine solidarity and the resistance of the Palestinian people, we can, or at least I can, conceive of a future situation where the leadership of the Palestinian people can take the Balfour Declaration, change it at critical points, and use it to the advantage of the Palestinian people. Again, taking the declaration as formulated and not necessarily as interpreted for political Zionist purposes, for apartheid purposes, for purpose of perpetrating international crimes. Dated November 2nd, 2033. Well, if I'm given another 20 years, I may witness it. I'm 70 this year. Dear Secretary General, I have much pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of a federal government of Socialist Democratic Republic of Palestine, the following declaration of sympathy with the aspiration of the Palestinian Hebrew people, which have been submitted to and approved by the Palestinian federal government. The federal government of Palestine view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Hebrew people of Palestine, formalized as the Hebrew state, wilaya in Arabic, of Palestine, consistent with the terms of UN General Assembly Resolution 1812 of 1947 and 194 of 1948, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Arab communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by people of Jewish origin in any other country. I should be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the peoples concerned. Thank you very much.
First, I'll start with my story a bit to tell you who I am and why I'm here. My background is in journalism. I don't happen to be Jewish or Muslim or Arab. My background is Presbyterian. 12 years ago, I was the editor of a very small weekly newspaper in Sausalito, California, writing about the local school district, the city council, the fishing fleet. The Middle East seemed distant, confusing, and irrelevant to my daily life, as it is with 2/3 to 3/4 of Americans who do not have strong views on this issue at all. In fact, really have no views on this issue, the large majority of Americans. I was among them. But then I suddenly saw those images for a brief time in the American news of children throwing stones against tanks in what I learned was the Second Intifada. And of course I then learned, well, not through the American media, but I learned that just meant uprising, something very familiar with Americans who had an intifada against Britain some centuries ago. I then began to look into it more and more for myself. on the internet and eventually multitudes of books, and began to learn that it was entirely different than the impressions I had from watching the movie Exodus, which is the extent of most American understanding. So it seemed so significant to me on so many levels that I finally decided to quit my job in Sausalito and go over and travel throughout the Palestinian territories by myself as a freelance reporter in early 2001, February and March of 2001. And I'll just show you a few of the slides that I took. These are all my photographs. So I saw what a fascinating, rich culture. I met a great deal of wonderful, intelligent, interesting people. I interviewed them with my notebook. I was there as a freelance reporter. I met their families. I was often invited to stay with families, and given the budget of a freelance reporter, I was very happy to accept that accommodation many times, both in the West Bank and in Gaza. I also saw what was happening to these people firsthand. I saw the flowers in the living room, the family photos on the wall. And I saw the family when they returned from the hospital, from their dead child. And I heard the mother and sisters weeping and weeping and weeping. And I saw the father walking around shell-shocked. It looked like he was sleepwalking in a bad dream that will never end. I saw the neighbors come in to try to comfort them. And I heard a man tell the father, when it looked like he was about to break down, "Your son is a bird in heaven now." And I saw the funeral and another funeral for a woman who had just been killed, who had 3 sons, 18, 14, and 12, and had been coming home from the market and had been killed. I won't go into everything. I saw, of course, more and more children who had been shot and injured. I agree with one of the previous speakers who talked about the importance of history. George Orwell, I think very accurately, said, "Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past." Well, I've shown you in the media who controls the present. And the past is also being controlled. There are very important aspects of the past on this issue, as on all issues, no doubt, that most Americans and most people, in fact, just don't know, and we need to know them. It's essential. So I'll try to fill in a few of the ones that might be the most interesting and the least known, and not repeat the ones that have been articulated earlier today. By 1910, there were already 20,000 Zionists in the U.S. And again, to reiterate what was said previously, this was obviously not close to a majority of Jewish Americans who were actually opposed to Zionism for many, many decades. In 1912, Zionist literature is where you learn often the history of this. So they were bragging about how wonderful their propaganda was and how effective and how much there was in the United States. In 1914, I have so little time left, but I'll get into what I can, there was a very significant development, both for the United States, for Palestine, for Israel, and for Balfour. In 1914, a man named Louis Brandeis, who is a very famous Supreme Court justice in the United States, there's a university named after him. Many people that study at universities have heard of the name Louis Brandeis. We've heard of very few previous Supreme Court justices. I could probably name, a handful. An early recruiter explained, quote, "An organization which has the aims we have must be anonymous, must work silently through education and infection. The majority of Americans have no idea. If we can get the information to them, and it won't happen by way of the media, if we can get them, when and if we do get them this information, we will, I feel, bring change. And that will then finally enable justice in Palestine." So thank you.
It traces its roots back to the 19th century, when a group of Christians in Britain began to speculate about the end of the world, the place of the Jews within God's purposes, and they had a strong conviction that it was their destiny to assist the Jews to come to recognize Jesus as their Messiah, would also return them to their historic homeland before Jesus could come back. it became known as Christian Zionism, as increasingly Christians in America got behind Zionism as a political movement. Well, they do take them very literally. They take these promises very literally, the promises God made to Abraham, and they believe that they're being fulfilled exclusively through the Jewish people. What they forget to remember is that when the promises were made, Abraham had neither had Isaac or Ishmael. And so from our perspective, we would read those same scriptures and see, yes, the promises were fulfilled through all of his children, not just his Jewish children. But I believe that Christian Zionists read the Bible in an incorrect way. They distort the Bible by taking promises that are 3,000-4,000 years old and applying them today without interpreting them in the light of Jesus' teaching and his apostles. Jesus teaches that we should treat everyone the same, that everyone has the need for food, for clothing, somewhere to live, and therefore it's immoral and it's wrong that we prejudice one people group, the Palestinians, and favour another, the Jewish people. We should treat the same, both peoples the same, and be a force for reconciliation rather than division. How we apply the Bible to a political situation today needs sensitivity, and any religion or theological view that is dogmatic and favours one people group against another is inconsistent. It undermines the teaching of the New Testament, which teaches us to have compassion for the poor, for widows, for orphans, for the stranger, and to treat those who recognise Jesus as our brothers and sisters. Therefore, if that's our overriding understanding of our responsibility to one another, then when we apply them politically, we can't favour one people group over against another. So either we support the two-state solution with Palestine as an independent, sovereign state alongside Israel, or we recognise Jews and Palestinians as citizens of one state, be it Israel, Palestine, or whatever. But the present political system, which prejudices Palestinians, that exclusively takes that land and gives it to the Jews or to Zionists, is not sustainable theologically for Christians or politically, as we see today.
It's when the Palestinian uprising began about 12 years ago, and I saw that in the news, I began to think, well, I'll try to understand Israel-Palestine and follow the news on this issue. And I quickly noticed how one-sided the news seemed to be, that it was really almost always about Israel and from the Israeli point of view, and we didn't ever get, well, we rarely got the Palestinian information. So that got me more and more curious. I looked into it more and more, and eventually I went over there and traveled as a freelance reporter by myself to just see for myself what was going on. Well, the trouble is most Americans, of course, Palestine's far away, and so they rely on the media to give us the information. And some people will try to read various newspapers and magazines and maybe watch various news reports on television, and they're doing their job to try to get the information. The news media are not doing their job, because both the liberal media and the conservative media are doing a very poor job of giving the full story about Israel-Palestine.